So here's a new process. This one is more based on drawing the silhouette as you shade, or shading as you draw the silhouette. So there's no line art except for the sketch that you see underlaying the drawing. What I do use is I use a flat brush, almost like a marker pen type of brush, to quickly shade in the shapes. And as I'm doing those, I'm also adding different shades, in this case of gray, and then I'm going to just color balance everything into the colors that I need. So I'm trying to make sure that this kind of dragon and crocodile mix look like they have this ridge along the back, like the model is really split in two, and that's why it has such a sharp edge. Now all the surfaces of the object I'm trying to keep, the surface of the character, I'm trying to keep clear where they're facing. So it's basically very basic shading stuff, which is the face is looking towards the light source, then it's brighter than the ones that are not. You also have the chance of using a very simplistic approach on shading. If you figure out what your bounce value is going to be, your bounce light value is going to be, you can just use that for any face that's not facing towards the light source right away. So you can just use that to shade any bounce light effects that you want. I'm adding a shadow here just to make sure that it reads that the object is not fully on the ground. There's part of the object that are lifted, and that's why you get to see those bounce lights. Now adding some speckles there with the brush just to create the sense of texture, but I abandon it as it's going to take a while. The great thing about this process is that because you do such a quick silhouette or shape with some shading in it, then you feel obligated to go in and detail the parts that you left. And as you detail, you add more stuff, so you basically gradually clean up the drawing, and that's the good thing, because you are adding that detail that you know you're going to need, but you already have the shades on the image, so you're pretty much picking within your range. You're pretty much picking the colors from within your range. I just added some of the texture there on the face just to remind myself to do that later on when I do the 3D model, just to have that as the texture for the face itself. Adding the wrinkles there for the limbs attaching to the body is pretty much just a way for me to make sure that it does not read like an inflatable object, like it really has folds. And I'm going to have some trouble doing those in a 3D model because folds appear and disappear as the model moves. So it's something that takes a little more technology than the one that I'm using right now for the 3D models. But even just having the shape of the folds in the model is good enough for people to read that that's not a toy, that's something that's a bit more organic. Therefore, the folds and the flash and then the skin. Again, the technique is fairly simple. I'm using just a bounce light there to make sure that it doesn't read like a completely dark surface. I'm keeping the blacks and the darker shades for the ambient occlusion effect. So just the parts that are really tucked in, they're really hard for light to get there. Those are the ones that get the darkest values. Everything else does get some bounce light from either the ground or from the limbs itself. And it takes up some of the time. The whole idea of shading takes up some of the time. But the point is, as you're shading, again, you're adding more information, not just shading a perfectly well-made line art. So if you have a really good line art, all the information is there. You're pretty much just shading in that. But without any line art, when you shade, that's when you add the information. So it's kind of cool that you're free to add a detail as you feel the drawing is needing it as you're shading, because then you figure out stuff that you hadn't thought about in the drawing, and you go like, okay, this looks good this way or that way. In the end, I opted for using a little bit of dodge just to brighten up the right side of the drawing here, because I thought it was getting a little too dark. Now the ridge in the back reads really well. I think there's a high contrast between the bright and the dark. So there's a clear light source on the left, but the right I thought was a little too dark. So I'm trying to get the folds as well on the back, and I'm not going to use color balance. I'm going to use curves because I feel that the color balance kind of limits me in that three factor, the highlights, the shadows, and the midtones. But with the curves, I can actually get fine adjustments. And I'm trying out a few things and figuring out what I want. I do want the highlights to be a bit yellow. I wanted this sort of green, ochre green. And now I'm just blurring out the shadows, and I'm going to blur it more where it's further away from the object. Where it's closer, I'll leave it sharp, and then blur it as it goes away. And that's pretty much it. That's the whole another technique that you guys can try.